Welcome to another edition of Down the Road. Jerry Leach is going to join us in a little bit. Now, who's Jerry? Well, she's the Cass County Jail Chaplain. She organizes all these people from different denominations to go into the Cass County Jail and bring religion to it, bring Christ to it. And that's one of the things that she and others do a lot of volunteer time on. And they've got a big fundraiser that's going to be going on tonight. So I want to make sure she gets a chance to tell you about it because I think it's a wonderful cause. There's a lot of people whose lives are turned around because of Jerry and the people that volunteer. I get a chance now to visit with a retired colonel in the U.S. Army, which that alone just screams screams of the fact that I need to respect this man. Colonel Jeff McCausland is the author of Battle Tested, Gettysburg Leadership Lessons for the 21st Century Leaders. Now, one of the reasons that we asked the Colonel to come on is because there's been a lot of questions out there about the exit of Afghanistan. And there's been a lot of talk about how we exited Vietnam and if we learn lessons from all of that. So let's bring the Colonel in. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for joining us.
Joel, it's a great pleasure to be with you.
Tell me why. Let's begin with the book, if you don't mind. Tell me what made you, a retired colonel in the U.S. Army, sit down and say, you know what, I'm going to write this book.
Well, Joel, for many years, I had been the Dean of Academics. That was my final duty assignment in the Army at the United States Army War College, which is located here in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, about 30 miles from Gettysburg. And every year, as part of the course for senior officers, we would take them down to Gettysburg for what the military calls a staff ride. And in fact, the park itself was created in the latter part of the 19th century, in part to allow military officers to use that field for that purpose, for the training of officers. Though focused on strategy and tactics and operations to a larger degree. So I've been going down there multiple times with students. It occurred to me over time, this was really a dramatic case study about leadership. You know, Joel, you and I, if we were allowed access to any organization, not-for-profit, government, corporation, baseball team, church, it wouldn't matter. If we were allowed free access, we could wander around for a couple of days, talk to people, see what was going on. At the end of a couple of days, we could probably tell a lot about how well or how poorly that particular organization was run. But if we arrived there on the day that the organization was in a crisis, well, then I would argue good leadership and bad leadership sticks out in bold relief because a crisis compresses time and leaders have to make decisions and the strength that they've built up in their organization is demonstrated or not. And that's why a battle like Gettysburg, which in essence is two organizations in a crisis, allow you to do that. And then secondarily, I believe the lessons of leadership are fungible across the ages. There's no thing necessarily as military leadership or business leadership or education leadership or entertainment leadership. It's just good leadership. The cultures may vary, but it's just good leadership. And so you can use that to tease out those concepts and principles that are enduring. And then finally, I think people learn well from stories. If you can connect a concept with a story, that has an enduring effect on the human mind.
Gettysburg has so many stories. When I knew I got a chance to visit with you about this, you know, I got excited just like a little kid because I've been to Gettysburg. I think the Civil War is a story that we can learn from, but I think it's best described by you. And let's take it from Gettysburg to Vietnam. What we could have learned from Gettysburg that we could have used better in Vietnam, or maybe even that we did use in Vietnam.
Right. Well, I think the first thing is, what is your vision for what you're trying to accomplish? You know, on the two sides in the American Civil War, their vision was pretty clear what they were trying to accomplish. Abraham Lincoln's vision was preserving the Union. But interestingly enough, at Gettysburg, he will expand on that vision in a famous speech on the 19th of November, 1863, after the battle, in which he talks about we're moving towards a new birth of freedom. So he expands that vision to being preserving the Union, ending slavery. They are now inextricably linked. But it was a clear vision of where we're going. The South, the Confederacy, like it or not, had a clear vision. Their vision was two things. One, to preserve slavery as an underpinning of Southern agrarian economy. They called it in those days the peculiar institution, but it was fundamental to how they viewed their economic and social structure. And second, to do that, to separate and become an independent state. Now, if you move to Vietnam, the question is, what is your vision? What is your purpose? And that becomes a lot more diffuse. Obviously, it's a lot more focused. The American Civil War is, to use a terrible metaphor, a home game. It was all about the existential survival of the United States. That will focus your attention. Was Vietnam about the existential survival of the United States? Not really. There were a lot of national interests involved. We were involved in a Cold War. There was worries about the so-called domino theory, but it fundamentally wasn't about our existence. And finally, in the American Civil War, because of that focus of vision, we were winning a war with Americans for Americans. And I've questioned, frankly, in my mind, looking back at Vietnam and frankly Afghanistan as well, whether you can actually win a war for somebody else. You can help them win it, you can guide them, you can support them, but fundamentally, if the population doesn't get behind that vision, you're never going to be successful. And I think that was one of our main problems in both Vietnam and Afghanistan, creating a political structure that the average South Vietnamese soldier or the average Afghan soldier was frankly willing to fight and die for.
Well, and I reserve the right to go back to the Civil War because I find it so fascinating, and clearly you're an expert when it comes to it. But I want to make sure that we get a chance to compare Vietnam and Afghanistan, because let me give you my take first, and then you can say, well, Joel, you got some of that right. My take on Afghanistan was, and you just did a great job of explaining what we were doing in Vietnam and whether or not that goal was clear. But my take on Afghanistan was we went to Afghanistan because of Al-Qaeda, and we went to Afghanistan to take out Osama bin Laden. And somewhere along that process, we turned into nation builders. And now again, you're fighting a war for someone else and for someone else's country. And I'd love to get your take on that.
No, I think you nailed it. You know, in 2001 and early 2002, our purpose was Al-Qaeda. You know, we were not necessarily going to war with the Taliban. It was just the Taliban was the controlling authority in Afghanistan. We had never recognized them, oh, by the way, as a government. Few countries had, but they were the controlling authority. There was no doubt about it. George W. Bush, as president, approached their leadership through our diplomats and said, hey, we have no quarrel with you. Give up Al-Qaeda, give up Osama bin Laden. That's what we're all about. The Taliban refused to do that, and the conflict was on. But we fought that war through surrogates in many, many ways. If you were an Afghan and you were in Kabul when it was, quote unquote, liberated from the Taliban, you didn't see Americans marching down the street. You saw the Northern Alliance march down the street. And these were largely Tajiks who had been at war with the Taliban, really controlled a northern portion of Afghanistan. There was a civil war going on when we arrived in 2001. So they liberated Kabul with U.S. air support. And then we lost focus. You're exactly right. We allowed Osama bin Laden to move across the mountains in Tora Bora into Pakistan, and we didn't pursue him. And you know, there's a great book, Back to Leadership, by Jim Collins called Entrepreneurship 2.0, that just came out. And I opened it up, like, swear to goodness, and just started reading a paragraph. And it was about this particular concept. He used Gettysburg. He said the problem was neither side at Gettysburg had an idea of how you exploit it if you're successful. The South planned Pickett's charge, but there's scant evidence of what they thought they would do if they were successful. The North planned to defend, but George Gordon Meade does not have a great plan to pursue if that's successful. So we plan and plan and plan. What do you do if it works? Well, it worked very rapidly in Afghanistan, but we didn't keep the first thing, and that is when Osama bin Laden and the remnants of Al-Qaeda fled into Pakistan, that's the time to go into Pakistan and crush that once and for all. But we just assumed that they had been defeated, and then you're right, we broadened our horizon now to making Afghanistan into a democracy, a market economy, dealing with women's rights. And then, oh, by the way, we were attracted by what I would call the next bright, shiny object, which was Iraq. And we assumed it would go as easy as Afghanistan. And when it didn't, then Afghanistan became a very economy of force operation, a secondary theater. and trundled along for about 7 or 8 years, allowing the Taliban and Al-Qaeda to resurrect.
You know, I never compared the two, but I find it fascinating to compare the two because you point out that wars can't be won through trying to message versus trying to be won. Let me give you an example of what I'm getting at. I'm hoping I'm right about this because of the respect I have of your knowledge of Gettysburg, but you know, we tried to send a message in Afghanistan that the Afghan army could be strong enough to make sure that they could take on the Taliban, to make sure that they wouldn't ever have to worry about Al-Qaeda calling it home again. But it was still a message. Without being there, we were expecting someone else to take that message everywhere. In Gettysburg, as my memory serves me, what the Battle of Gettysburg was about Robert E. Lee trying to send a message to the U.S. that we can get behind you. We can find a way to get behind you logistically and scare you enough that you want to quit, bringing war to us. And I'm curious about the comparison between those two.
Well, I think you're, again, pretty well close to the mark. What I would say, and I always tell people when you talk about the Battle of Gettysburg, please keep in mind, Robert E. Lee does not come north to win a battle. He comes from north to win the war. This is all about winning the war. And he realizes we got to get this over with because we cannot sustain it. And the Confederacy actually has a strategic planning conference in Richmond in May of 1863, where all the leadership, military and political, come together to decide what they're going to do. They have multiple options. They agree to Lee's proposal to go north, defeat the Yankees on Yankee soil, threaten or capture at least a major state capital. Their operational objective actually was Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, a major state capital, because they knew a couple of things. One, they were at the tipping point of foreign recognition by the British and the French, which might be decisive in winning war. And number two, they knew that Abraham Lincoln was 1 year out from being reelected. And if we can embarrass him at a minimum, we may tip the scales. He doesn't get reelected. Somebody does who's willing to negotiate. But you're quite right. The message we were also trying to send in Afghanistan was we're about winning this war, about defeating the Taliban through the vehicle of training the Afghan army. And we worked on that for like 15 to 20 years. But it became clear after a while that military leaders started talking about, well, the only solution here is a political solution. Because, again, I think at times one of our mistakes, and it may sound silly, but I do think it's fundamental, is we kept talking about the Taliban as the Taliban, the Taliban, the Taliban. It's like they were a bunch of aliens that had arrived from another planet. We forget fundamentally that the Taliban were Afghans. They were Pashtuns, which occupy about 40% of the population, particularly in the south. So that makes the marker of defeating them politically a lot higher because they are Afghans and therefore easily identify ethnically, religiously, and socially with the population. And no matter what you like, you can stay there forever. But Americans, Europeans are always going to be foreigners. And there's a lot of history and culture in Afghanistan about how it feels about foreign occupiers.
I do want to ask you, because this question comes at me a lot, as a criticism of the current administration, as a criticism of the U.S. Military as a whole, that we left behind just a ton of equipment in Afghanistan and equipment that could be used against us another day. How does that compare historically?
Well, we did the same thing in Vietnam. We left tons of equipment. We dumped equipment in the ocean that we couldn't get out of Vietnam rapidly enough. But there was enormous differences in the two withdrawals. And I think the first thing you have to do is, in both cases, Vietnam and Afghanistan, is separate the decision to leave from the actual execution of the operation to withdraw. You might agree with it's time after 20 years, for example, to leave Afghanistan, but you might be very critical, as I have been in some of the writing I have, of how that actual withdrawal was conducted, okay? The other differences were, of course, in the case of Vietnam, we had pulled out our forces based on an agreement that we reached with the North Vietnamese. Again, a key difference. Vietnam was actually invaded by North Vietnam at the end. The insurgency, the so-called the Viet Cong, were largely pretty much decimated by the end of the Tet Offensive. the Tet Offensive, though they were successful politically in taking over cities, they didn't hold them. And the VC got pretty decimated. And after that, it was really a war between the United States, South Vietnam, and North Vietnam. And at the end, don't forget, it was a North Vietnamese tank breaking through the gates of the U.S. Embassy that demonstrated the war was over in Vietnam. And they had crossed the demilitarized zone and moved into the country from the north. In the case of the Taliban, it was still largely an internal insurgency. There was not an external country that was part of that final assault. But large amounts of equipment were left on both sides. When we also had pulled our forces out, the United States still provided a substantial amount of military equipment to the South Vietnamese army. But it was the Congress eventually voting to discontinue military assistance to South Vietnam that finally put the last nail, if you will, in South Vietnam's coffin. Whereas in the similar case in Afghanistan, we made the assumption, which drove the train of the withdrawal in that case, that the government would survive for a period of time with material assistance for us, but no troops, at least 6 months to a year to 2 years. So if you we drew a metaphor to our experience in Vietnam, but in this case it was flawed, or we drew a metaphor, frankly, to the withdrawal of the Soviet Union. And don't forget, the Soviet Union withdrew after about 10 years in Afghanistan. But the government they put in place, again with material arms support by Moscow, survived for 2 years or more before the Taliban toppled them. So one of the key differences was that assumption that based with just material support, this government in Kabul would survive as it had in Saigon, or it has had before, proved totally flawed. And we saw the withdrawal move very quickly, and the Taliban also moved more quickly than they thought they would. They were actually very surprised by their success.
I want to talk to you a little bit about the comparisons and contrasts between how the military not only responded, as you just mentioned, but were surprised. Am I false in assuming that in both circumstances, maybe more so in Afghanistan, that the perception was the Afghan army could give us the time we needed to withdraw, and that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda might, Al-Qaeda being through different channels, just surprised the living, out of us, and that was a big failing when it came to our withdrawal, and we didn't get it, until we were too late.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think when the Taliban had learned from their past lessons, I think, and had really a pretty effective strategy. And their strategy was to really build up their power in the rural areas. Don't concentrate their power against cities, because concentrating their power against cities forced them to concentrate their forces, and therefore they're more easily attacked, particularly by the U.S. air power. But they concentrated their efforts in the rural areas. And over time, if you've seen over the last year or two, many of the cities then became an island surrounded by a sea of Taliban who controlled the provincial areas. And this also, I think, comes back to a similarity between Vietnam. And that is, in the rural areas of Afghanistan, life hasn't changed a great deal, I don't believe, since 2001. And one of the big errors were we never were able to create a government that provided what we would call the essential social services, as you did for your great state when you were in the legislature, provided basic services that then translated into the allegiance of the population. There was a very famous, actually I quote this often, 9th century Islamic scholar, believe it or not, over 1,000 years ago. He once said something fundamentally important then and now. He said, there can be no government without an army, no army without money, no money without prosperity, and no prosperity without justice and good administration. Well, that never occurred in the countryside, so why should I be loyal to this government, which is in Kabul, which is very, very corrupt, okay? In similar fashion, why should I be loyal to Saigon, which is this succession of generals who are taking over one after the other and are also very corrupt? Our inability to create that type of good administration, good governance, and see that spread out across the country forced us, I think, not to have an army that was going to sustain over time and fold it up as quickly as we saw in Afghanistan.
Colonel, did we lose those wars?
Well, that's a really good question. You could say we didn't lose in the classical sense, excuse me, that there was a peace treaty and a surrender. but we certainly never accomplished our strategic goals as best one can define them to be, and that is to create independent democratic societies in both countries. And our inability to do that, and whether or not that's even possible through another country without that being, a centerpiece of their own view of life, was certainly a failing, and we lost in achieving that particular strategic vision. That's for certain.
Well, my father was still alive, and he fought in World War II, and he was there in the Pacific Theater, and he was on the ground in Japan after the bombings. And the one thing that he always said, when in 1978, he was working on the road, and I had an Army recruiter come to our house. And what I didn't realize, my mom was in Rochester at the time with her mom, who was quite sick. And so the neighbor, which I didn't realize, was keeping a close eye on a 17-year-old kid who thought he was living all alone. And I had the Army recruiter come. And my passion was going to the Army. And my dad came home from working on the road in road construction, and he looked at me and he said, there's a recruiter been to the house, I heard. First thing I thought was, no, man, he knows more than just that. The second thing I thought was, that he'd be proud of that. He wasn't. He was mad. And the reason he was mad, and he told me, you're not going in, is because of the fact that this country doesn't know how to treat and use its military. That when he gets in, as he put it, when we get into war, we make our people fight with one hand tied behind their back. And he was still mad when he passed away on that. And I would love to get your take on it, Colonel.
Well, I think, first of all, I'm the living proof that the military does take care of people. I mean, I often say, back to my dad, who never got to go to high school because he, in the 1930s, joined the Civil Conservation Corps because he was trying to support his family, and joins the Army before the war starts and then goes through World War II. And by being in the military and going to West Point, I got a free college education. I have a master's degree and a doctorate. I'm my father's wildest dream. It really demonstrates that that's possible in America. Colin Powell, who recently passed away, often would say, as the child of Jamaican immigrants, hardworking people in the South Bronx, that his success proved what a great country the United States truly was. Now, he said that in testimony when he was being reviewed by the Senate to become Secretary of State. So I think that is true. Certainly in major conflicts, World War II, there was a winner and a loser. There was no doubt on the battleship Missouri that day on the deck when Douglas MacArthur was sitting there, who was winning and who was losing, okay? When we make our way to Germany and the Russians take the Berlin and put up their flag on the Reichstag, there's no doubt who won and who lost, okay? That's pretty doggone clear. The conflicts, unfortunately, we've been involved in since World War II have not been as clear because they have been counterinsurgency warfare at times, these sort of nebulous conflicts at times, often with the overhang of potential nuclear escalation that nobody wanted to go to, which caused you not to go to using every particular weapon behind you. And that makes the mission of the U.S. military a lot more complicated and a lot more difficult. And as a consequence, in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, and Vietnam, we get thrust into this nation-building mode, which we're not very good at. And I think coming out of Afghanistan, really a little bit of humility would be a worthy thing to happen, and a review, and just to think through, is it really possible for us to totally refocus a society whose ethnicity, culture, and history is so totally different than ours?
Yeah. The book is called Battle Tested, Gettysburg Leadership Lessons for the 21st Century Leaders. Colonel, can I call you again and just talk about the Civil War itself?
Anytime.
I would love to, because you mentioned West Point, and I'd love you to compare and contrast when I have more time with Grant and Lee. I think there's a whole story there as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Colonel. Thanks for coming on with us.
My great pleasure. Thanks for having me.